Hi, I'm RJ, and for this session, we're going to talk about the elements of an income tax return. So, for our agenda in this session, we're going to talk about the elements in a tax return and how they are measured, as well as the possible tax liability for each of those elements. So, the question is, how do you usually report items at the tax returns? Now, this is actually eerily similar to how we prepare our statement of comprehensive income because we usually start with our revenues. And then we, of course, deduct our cost of sales or cost of services to come up with our gross income. The next item would be something that is unique to tax returns because instead of reporting operating expenses, we now then report the allowable deductions to come up with our taxable income. Now, the next issue is how do we usually measure these items in our tax returns? So usually, when it comes to our gross income, we usually report everything. Everything talaga. So if ever, usually ang sinasabi ko sa mga students, if in doubt, include those items. For our allowable deductions, there's actually a specific criteria set upon by Revenue Memorandum Circular 81-2025. So you have to download that, and whatever expenses or expenditures that you're going to incur, it should be related sa activities ni taxpayer. Now, when it comes to your operating expenses, be sure to secure the sales and service invoice and properly documented ang iyong mga deductions, because if not, there's actually a possibility that this would be disallowed and tataas ang iyong taxable income. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, kailangan mo mag-secure ng sales or service invoice, kaya dapat kung sino man yung supplier or service provider mo ay BIR registered. So kung makikita mo, ang dami-daming requirement pag allowable deduction, pero pag gross income mas pabor sa gobyerno, because when it comes to allowable deductions, these are actually interpreted in favor of the government. Why kamo? Because since these are deductions, these are abhorred by the government or kinamumihan ng ating gobyerno. Kasi pag mas malaki ang mga deductions mo, mas bababa ang tax revenue na maaring makolekta galing sa ating mga taxpayers. Now, to continue sa ating mga allowable deductions, there's actually some instances that you might need to withhold taxes from your expenses. Usually, mga top taxpayers ang nare-require neto, pero minsan, out of our expenditures, meron rin dito kailangan nating pag-withholdan ng taxes. At ano-ano nga ba yun? Yun ay nakasaad sa ating Revenue Regulations 11-2018 at Revenue Regulations 24-2025. Now, for example, meron kang mga empleyado. So, you would incur salaries expense. And if that is the case, you might need to withhold taxes from them. And then, of course, issue BIR Form 2307 or 2316 to your payees and withhold the taxes and remit the taxes to our government. Now, if you fail to do this, you might incur any penalties for failure to properly withhold and remit. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, yung mga allowable deductions natin should be related to your operations. Ngunit apart from the usual operating expenses natin, nasasabay din dito yung mga mandatory deductions or contributions ng mga employers sa kanilang empleyado tulad ng SSS, PhilHealth, at Pag-ibig. Now, what if yung empleyado shouldered the cost of the supplies related to the work? Would this be considered as an allowable deduction pagdating sa income tax return ng ating empleyado? The answer is no. Kasi yung mga compensation income earners cannot necessarily avail allowable deductions. The next question now is what usually the tax obligations in each of the elements of our income tax returns. So, pagdating sa ating revenue, pinapatawan to usually ng mga business taxes. For example, yung mga 3% percentage tax or value-added tax. And as we have discussed just a while ago, pagdating sa cost of sales or services as well as allowable deductions, there might be a chance that you might be required by our revenue regulation to withhold taxes based on certain criteria. Now, since after we have deducted the cost of sales from our revenue, we would come up with our gross income. At alam nyo ba, yung gross income ay maaari ring patawan ng buwis o yung minimum corporate income tax, pero applicable lang ito sa ating mga corporate entities. And finally, meron rin tayong taxable income kung saan ito naman ay pinapatawan ng mga usual income tax rates natin. For example, yung mga fixed corporate income taxes na 25% to 20%, as well as yung mga graduated tax rates kung saan habang lumalaki ang taxable income mo, mas lumalaki rin ang pinapataw na tax rate na para sa iyo. Is this considered as double taxation? Not necessarily so, because even though itong mga taxes nito ay pinapataw sa ating taxpayer for that same tax period, however, you would notice na iba pa rin ang kanilang mga tax base. So for example, as you have noticed, business tax ang pinapataw natin sa revenue, pero pagdating sa taxable income, income tax naman ang ating ipinapataw. Now, pagdating naman doon sa minimum corporate income tax, medyo controversial siya kasi usually the idea is pag meron kang taxable income, papatawan ka ng income tax. However, if you will incur net loss, negative yung taxable income mo, then usually wala kang income tax at that rate. However, since merong minimum corporate income tax, it's possible na kahit lugi ka, maaaring magbayad ka pa rin ng taxes. So, there you have it. As we have mentioned a while ago, ito yung ating mga pinag-usapan kanina. We have talked about the elements in a tax return and how they are measured and the possible tax liability for each of those elements. Again, I'm RJ. If ever you have questions, please reach out. Thank you very much.